So, first of all, I would welcome these participants who are all junior advocates. I will welcome them to the profession. As I understand, all of you who are participating, who are here to hear this topic, are enrolled only after 1st January 2020. So that means you are just new entrants to this profession. And I take this opportunity to welcome all of you to this noble profession. Let me take this opportunity to speak something briefly about this profession. You all must be aware that this profession is considered as a noble profession. Initially, it was not done with the object of earning livelihood. What I need to impress upon you is that in this profession, you will have to continuously work hard. There is no substitute for hard work. Those who have taken to this profession, they cannot expect an easy or very comfortable life. As you know, advocates have to continuously keep on reading, struggling. Then there are moments of stress. Of course, the financial aspect also matters. You need to earn something, you need to have some livelihood. So all these factors, they create stress in your mind. But always be studious, keep on reading, go into the deeper study of law, argue the cases fearlessly. Remember that you are not only acting for your clients, but also as an officer of the court. And there is a dual responsibility on you. Unless you function properly, it may not be possible for the court to deliver justice, which is the ultimate aim of the legal system. So I wish good luck to all of you. As I said, I welcome you all. I hope many of you will become judges at various levels. Some of you will become administrators, politicians, and some of you will certainly become very senior, respected members of the bar. Thank you very much. Now, the subject. We'll start with the subject jurisprudence in criminal trial. There was some slight variation. I would like to tell the Bar Council officials that when the email invitation was given to me, it was mentioned as jurisprudence in criminal law. And now the subject which I see, of course, is that jurisprudence in criminal trial. Of course, it doesn't make a difference because the subject is such a vast subject that almost all the principles of the criminal law need to be addressed to you. Now, let us first understand briefly that what is jurisprudence. We are not here to define jurisprudence because that itself will require a separate lecture because there are differences of opinion on what jurisprudence actually means. That is the wisdom of the law. But basically and broadly, it can be said to be the philosophy of the law. It discusses what is actually the law, why it is so. So we need not go into that, except that this discusses the principles of law. You have to study the law as a science, study the philosophy behind the provisions. Now, why criminal jurisprudence? Because jurisprudence is a common thing for civil and criminal. So jurisprudence, criminal, when we focus on criminal jurisprudence, what we mean the principles which are peculiar to criminal law only. There is a basic difference between civil law or civil trials and criminal law and criminal trials. It is because civil law is basically it's in the nature of remedies for private wrongs, if we may say so. I don't want to complicate the issues with so many references to the jurisprudence theories. But civil law, basically it is to honor the personal legal right of a person that the civil law has been enacted, and remedies are usually damages. So the civil law treats the personal wrongs. It provides for remedies against what we may call as personal wrongs. Whereas crimes, as you know, they are treated as wrongs against the society. Wrongful conduct is there in civil law as well as in criminal law. But criminal law, the wrongful conduct is of such a nature that it is to be treated as a wrong affecting the whole society, not only the victim. And therefore, the states takes the responsibility of punishing the offender. In civil law, the idea is more to compensate the victim. The idea is to give damages to him. But in criminal law, the basic idea is to punish the offender, and there are various different forms of punishment provided under the laws which we have. But of course, compensation is an aspect that is also considered in criminal law, but the criminal proceedings are not instituted with the object that the victim should be compensated. The object is that the offender should be penalized so that the others who are likely to commit such offenses or who have such tendencies will deter from doing that. So we'll just see what are the principles of criminal jurisprudence and then how these principles are embodied in various acts which provide for criminal trials. Now, of course, first we'll start, you will know that the laws are of two types basically, substantive laws and procedural laws. Now, substantive laws are the laws which define the offense and provide for punishment, like IPC. IPC is the major substantive law in the criminal field. Then there are laws which provide that how an offender is to be tried. Suppose a person commits an offense, there has to be a method by which it is to be decided by the court whether he has done it or not. And for that, a procedure has been prescribed, which is the Code of Criminal Procedure. Then again, there is a question as to on what basis the court will decide that whether the person brought before it is guilty or not, whether he has committed the wrong attributed to him or not. So for that, the court, on what material the court will act. For that, we have the rules of evidence. So there are three major acts, the IPC, the Code of Criminal Procedure, and the Indian Evidence Act, which cover a large part of criminal jurisprudence, and the provisions in these acts are based on the fundamental principles of criminal jurisprudence, which have been evolved over a span of about 2000 years in various jurisprudences, and which are considered so fundamental that they are also included in Universal Declaration of Human Rights and various conventions to which India is also a party. Now, let us first see what are the essential principles of criminal law. Now, the first that I would like to start with is that act alone does not constitute an offense. No, offense is a wrong which is punishable by law. So, act alone does not constitute an offense unless it is accompanied by a guilty mind. This is the first principle of criminal law. A person cannot be punished unless he holds a particular state of mind which is culpable or which is to be treated as a guilty mind. Sometimes unintentionally some wrong may be caused to a person, like accidentally you give some push to somebody who falls down and sustains some injury. Undoubtedly, if you have been negligent, you will be liable to compensate him in civil law. But you may not be guilty of any crime unless it comes within the parameters of law. Because you have no intention to cause any harm. There is no guilty state of mind. It is just an accident. So first we must understand is that act alone does not constitute any offense unless it is accompanied by a particular state of mind, the guilty state of mind, which is described by mens rea. Now, mens rea is not a fixed formula. It takes different shapes depending on the offense. For instance, in case of cheating or forgery, the mens rea will be the fraudulent or dishonest mind. In case of murder, it will be the mind which intentionally wants to cause hurt to somebody, which is described by the term voluntarily in the offenses relating to grievous hurt, etc. Now, we will go further to examine this principle. First, let me tell the principles of criminal jurisprudence, and then we'll go back and see how these principles find place in the substantive law or even the procedural laws. Like, absence of criminal intention, it comes under general exceptions, to which I propose to deal with little later. So this is one fundamental principle of criminal law. Now, general exceptions we'll see later based on this. Now, first of all, the fundamental principle of criminal law, which is now recognized by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights also, and it forms parts of all civilized jurisprudences, that is presumption of innocence. It means that every person is presumed to be innocent unless proven guilty. A person is arrested, is accused of having committed an offense. One cannot proceed on the basis that he has done it. One has to proceed on the basis that there is nothing against him, and it will do every ingredient of the offense in order to establish the charge against him. As you must have studied this is not a principle enacted in any statute, but this is so fundamental to criminal law that any principles running contrary to that, if enacted, would not be considered as valid. They will become unconstitutional, as we know that our constitution ensures that there will be a fair, just, and reasonable procedure if a person is to be deprived of his life and liberty. Article 21 says. It says that no one shall be deprived of his life and liberty except by procedure established by law. And the courts have over the years expanded the meaning of the term procedure established by law so as to mean a fair, just, and reasonable procedure. Now, what is justice is something which is beyond law. We are basically, it is assumed that human beings are capable of knowing what is just and what is unjust in a given situation. Law only recognizes those principles. So, to be a procedure, to be a fair procedure, one has to hold that the person who is accused of having committed an offense has to prove nothing. He is not to prove his innocence, but it is for the prosecution to establish his guilt. This is what is known as presumption of innocence. In fact, it is based on logic and common sense. Because everybody who wants to assert a fact, the burden naturally will be on whom? But it is more clearly and categorically recognized in criminal law. Now, as a result of this principle, secondary principle which follows from it, which is also equally important, equally respected and recognized, is that the burden of proof, which we said, that burden of proving the guilt is always on the prosecution and it is never on the accused, except for the statutory exceptions to which we will make a reference during this lecture, that in which cases there will be burden on the accused to establish a thing. But those will be secondary things. That an accused has committed an offense, that burden will ultimately be on the prosecution and it will never shift. In civil cases, burden often shifts. Not so in criminal cases. Even if there may be some aspects of the matter, the burden of which will lie on the accused, but even if the accused doesn't discharge that burden or fails to discharge it, that would not mean that the prosecution is bound to succeed because of that, because the overall burden is always on the prosecution to prove that the accused has committed the offense with which he is charged. Now, the burden of proof is always on the prosecution. That is the second principle which we understand. The third principle also follows from this, that in criminal cases, the charge against the accused must be proved beyond reasonable doubt. All of you must be very familiar with this phrase, beyond reasonable doubt. It will be not possible to define what it actually means because it will vary from time to time, and as many jurists have said, that words are quite inadequate sometimes to convey the thought properly. It is a matter to be gathered by experience. What it means is that the tribunal, the court which is deciding the matter, should be fully satisfied that the person has done this. Reasonable doubt is one to which a sensible reason can be supplied. If by thinking rationally you have some doubt whether the man has done it or not, then the fact is not proved. And here lies a major distinction between the civil law and criminal law. You all know that in civil cases, a case is required to be proved by preponderance of probabilities. And in criminal cases, it is to be proved beyond reasonable doubt. You can't decide the guilt of the accused by preponderance of probabilities. That will be patently illegal. We may observe that the Evidence Act, which defines the term proved, it doesn't make any distinction between civil cases and criminal cases. And that is why I said that this is a principle of criminal jurisprudence, that the guilt must be proved beyond reasonable doubt. When we speak of jurisprudence, in order to know that these principles are justified, otherwise we'll not have faith in them. We'll just say and will not actually follow that. We must also know the reason. The reason is that the consequences are far more severe in criminal cases, consequences of an erroneous decision. Consequences of a wrongful acquittal or wrongful conviction, when we consider, there is unanimity of opinion that the consequences of a wrongful conviction are more dangerous for the society as well as for the individual who suffers that wrongful conviction. Undoubtedly, when a criminal escapes, there is also a failure of justice, and that will also have its own repercussions. But wrongful acquittal will not be as serious as wrongful conviction. Just think that a criminal who has been caught, he undergoes a trial, goes through so many problems, and ultimately is acquitted. Well, that's bad enough. But if the other case, compare it with this, that a person who has done nothing, he is falsely implicated, he undergoes the tremendous torture during the trial, and then he is convicted and rest of the life is spent in prison. Just think of his family, just think what he will be thinking about the society, the system, not only about the legal system, but the society in general, and whether that man can then again be a part of the society. Can he be a good member of the society? Very difficult. If he is actuated by feelings of revenge and leads to crime, takes a life towards crime, then only the society or the legal system which caused such wrongful conviction is to be blamed. Therefore, to guard against the wrongful convictions which may follow, this rule has been enacted. It is said that it is enforced at the cost of acquittal of the guilty sometimes. The law does recognize this possibility, that when we insist on proof beyond reasonable doubt, you permit some cases where the guilty would probably escape. But yes, law tolerates that. It selects that it is a lesser evil. It prefers that over a wrongful conviction, and therefore there is no change in this fundamental principle of criminal jurisprudence, in spite of some modern legislations where some burden has been placed on accused. But that doesn't change this position, that the guilt of an accused must be proved beyond reasonable doubt. So these are the principles of criminal law. And of course, beyond reasonable doubt also follows a sub-principle that if there is a doubt ultimately, then the benefit of that should go to the accused, which is termed as benefit of doubt. So accused is entitled to the benefit of doubt. Now, well, friends, the subject is so vast that one doesn't know when and from which enactment one has to start. As I said, these principles find place in the IPC also, in the Code of Criminal Procedure also, and in the Evidence Act also. So we'll select the important principles and see how at the trial stage they are reflected. Since IPC is a substantive offense, I feel that we may start with the Indian Penal Code. Now see, the Indian Penal Code, it defines various terms. Generally in the Indian Penal Code, while stating the ingredients of an offense, that is while defining an offense, the ingredients, that is of mens rea, are already made a part of the definition of the section. Like in cheating, they say, whosoever deceiving, by deceiving a person fraudulently or dishonestly, these phrases are used. Voluntarily, when it comes to these causing of hurt, etc., those offenses against body. Then in theft, it is used dishonestly, intent to defraud. All these concepts are used. But there again, we come to a principle of criminal jurisprudence. Suppose a statute doesn't decide that if you do this with dishonest intention or a particular mens rea or a particular state of mind, then only it is an offense. It doesn't say that. What will happen? So there also the principle of interpretation is well settled, that the requirement of mens rea is to be read into the definition of any offense unless it is excluded by necessary implication. Like that happens in some statutes we call as of strict liability, like taxation. If you evade the tax, whether you intended or not, law will not inquire into that. Like license, suppose you can't do a business without a license, then your mens rea is not required in that case. Proof that you were doing the business without license is sufficient. So barring such statutory offenses for which generally the punishments are not that high, in all other offenses, whether the law specifically mentions about the requirement of a guilty state of mind or not, it has to be presumed, it has to be read into the definition of the statute. This is one aspect of the matter. Now, after these offenses are defined in the IPC, various terms are defined: wrongful gain, wrongful loss. One important definition in IPC, section 52, one must keep in mind. If you are practicing on criminal side, you can't lose sight of that. That is the definition of good faith. It is defined in a very peculiar way. Nothing is said to be done in good faith unless it is done with due care and attention. Means the IPC, which deals with crimes, has somewhat extended the scope of good faith. It is not the actual good faith that matters. Actual good faith, but if that is the faith developed after taking due care and attention, if after doing that you have a particular belief in your mind and you do any act which is done in good faith, then it can be called as an act done, then it would not amount to an offense in most of the cases, except where exceptions are provided. Now we come to another principle of criminal jurisprudence which is evolved, that is in the nature of punishment. Once you find a man guilty, he is to be punished. So these punishments are also provided in the IPC and of course in some other laws which create various other offenses. As I said, IPC is the major code. Most of the offenses are contained in IPC, but there are other laws dealing with other offenses. Like POCSO, there's a Negotiable Instruments Act. There are various offenses in various other penal statutes. So these punishments, now we must know that the barbaric punishments have been done away with. Initially, the punishments in all civilizations were of such a nature so as to inflict terrible torture, physical, mental torture on the offender. Now, these punishments are done away with. They are contrary to the human rights. They amount to direct violations of human rights, and all the civilized nations and all the jurisprudence have been forced to accept or prohibit punishments which are termed as barbaric. So most of the jurisdictions will have the type of punishments which we are having in India. So the first punishment is, the highest punishment is death. Now you know that whether death should be given as and by way of punishment for any offense is always been a controversial subject. Today also there are many controversial aspects to that. There are many people who believe that death should be abolished as a punishment. There are many countries which have abolished death as a punishment. One of the reasons for this is given as the for abolishing is that we may commit an error in holding a person to be guilty. We are not fully equipped to find out the facts. we are guided by certain material, and at times it can be absolutely wrong. What is the argument against death penalty is that once you have executed the sentence, there will be no remedy left if later on it turns out that the man was innocent. And I must tell you that there have been reported cases, particularly from UK, I have noticed that after a person was hanged, the real offender was found, and then nothing could be done. So this is only one aspect, but nevertheless, we have retained the death penalty, though by judicial pronouncements of the Supreme Court, it is rarely given. Where there is an option, generally death is not given. There was one section in the IPC 303 which provided for a mandatory death penalty, which has been struck down as unconstitutional, but we don't want to go into the details because I have to cover so many aspects of criminal trial for persons like you who will be gaining further knowledge by your experience and by being in this profession. So death is the highest penalty that the law recognizes. Then next comes to imprisonment for life. Now, imprisonment for life, though it is called as for life, the state government or the central government has power to commute it after a person has undergone a particular number of years in prison. So that will be too technical an aspect, and in this type of lecture, I don't wish to cover. But imprisonment for life, though it ordinarily means that it should include the whole life term of the offender, in practice, it is always cut down to a certain number of years. Of course, one has to, offender has to meet certain requirements, his conduct, so many factors are there, but the government has authority to commute it after he has undergone 14 years of imprisonment. So next type of punishment is imprisonment for a term. Imprisonment for a term is different from imprisonment for life. One has to understand it thoroughly. It's not that imprisonment for a term expands and gets converted into imprisonment for life. It's a different type of punishment for which originally transportation of life was provided as a punishment, which is now imprisonment for life. So imprisonment for a term. Generally, what will be the imprisonment and what will be the term to which the offender will be subjected would depend on the discretion of the court. Law generally provides the maximum term which an offender will undergo if he is found guilty, and then it is for the judge to decide what should be given in a given case. There are some provisions and some offences for which a minimum has also been provided, where the legislature has reduced the discretion of the judge in the matter of sentence by providing that the sentences shall be extending to this, but subject to such a such minimum. So minimum may be 1 year, 6 months, depending on that particular provision. In some cases, such minimum sentence also can be cut down for special and adequate reasons to be recorded by the court, which again shows the intention of the lawmakers not to deprive the judge of his discretion fully, and still there should be some cases. But of course, the special reasons are to be there. Now, this imprisonment for a term is of two types. That is rigorous imprisonment and simple imprisonment. We need not go into the details that law provides. Sometimes for some offences only simple imprisonment can be awarded. Rigorous imprisonment is the imprisonment with hard labor. Simple imprisonment is you can't be forced to work. And the fourth type of punishment is fine. So fine, of course, you know, money, how much fine will be imposed will depend on that offense. And when it is not provided, there is no limit on the amount of fine that can be imposed, but it has to be reasonable, of course. Now, one important thing which I would like to mention, that suppose a fine is not paid, then the court has been given a power to impose a sentence in default of payment of fine. This will be in addition to the sentence of imprisonment, if any, awarded to the offender. Now, here these 2 points which I find, they are very simple. You have studied all this, but I have seen in practice many people are not very, very much aware of it, or at times they miss it. See, imprisonment for in default of payment of fine, if the offence is punishable with fine only, can never exceed 6 months. Even if the fine is of 10 crores, If the offense is punishable with fine alone, then the imprisonment in default which court can award is only 6 months. No imprisonment for default can exceed that. In other cases where imprisonment is also a punishment and there is fine also can be imposed, both can be imposed for the offense, then of course the fine, the imprisonment in default of fine cannot exceed 1/4 of the maximum term of the imprisonment that can be awarded for the offense. For instance, if the offense is punishable with 3 years and fine, and the fine is not paid and a default sentence is to be imposed, then the default sentence cannot be more than the scale which is given by the IPC, but there is a further rider that it cannot exceed 1/4, that is 9 months in case of an offense. So these are all very basic things, but I touched it because I find that they are of some practical utility. Now, another principle which we must know, though it relates to punishment, that if you have undergone the sentence in default of payment of fine, it does not automatically mean that you are now exonerated and you need not pay the fine, that your liability to pay the fine comes to an end. It is not that way. Where the fines are huge, nothing prevents the state from recovering the fine in spite of the fact that you have undergone the sentences. Of course, there are some provisions which say that if you have undergone the sentence, then there ought to be some special reasons for that, etc. That will be a very highly technical and detailed discussion. Though we completed this topics of punishments. Now, absence of criminal intent. Now, as we said, that I said that we'll come to that, because act alone does not constitute any offense, and therefore it should be accompanied by a guilty mind to qualify it as an offense. So, where there is no guilty mind, then how could one be said to have committed the offense? So now this is in chapter 4 of the IPC, where there are some exceptions. These are applicable to all offenses under the IPC, even if it is not specifically mentioned in those offenses, and that is why it is called a general exceptions. And the IPC, Indian Penal Code, states that while reading the definition of every crime, it is to be read subject to the provisions regarding general exceptions. So now general exceptions we find in chapter 4 of the IPC, and it is very, it's unnecessary, will not be very proper also in this type of lecture to try to cover the general exceptions, because every exception may require long time if we are to discuss it fully. But I will tell you certain important things out of that. See, the you must read, of course, this chapter, and you must master these thoroughly. But one is act likely to cause harm but done without criminal intent, that is section 81. Then act of child under 7 years of age, section 82. Of course, you must be aware that the law says that nothing is an offense which is done by a child under 7 years of age, because the law attributes, the law assumes that he cannot be attributed with a guilty intention or the guilty mind. The tender age itself is a guarantee that he is incapable of forming the requisite intention, and therefore, even if he commits the actus reus, what the act constituting the offense, ingredients of the offense, still it will be absolutely no, there will be absolutely no offense. The act will not be criminal, and there is no doubt about it. Only the age is the criteria. So you must know this. Now, next comes, of course, the child between 7 and 12 of immature understanding, which is also, totally immune, but provided that the child is not sufficiently mature, child above 7 years, but under 12. So then the matter comes in the sphere of evidence, his actual condition, whether he has sufficient understanding of those factors will understand. But these provisions you must keep in mind. Then intoxication is ordinarily not a defense unless a person has been administered the intoxicating substance against his will. Then act done by consent, that is not intended to cause death but done in good faith for the person's benefit, that is section 85. And there is an illustration. I would suggest that you must study these sections and particularly the illustrations which explain the provisions very clearly. I would read the illustration here. A surgeon, knowing that a particular operation is likely to cause death of Z, who suffers under a painful complaint, but not intending to cause Z's death and intending in good faith Z's benefit, performs that operation on Z with Z's consent. Now, even if Z dies, A has committed no offense. So we will not go into all that. But what I would think is one thing, section 95, trifling acts, it says nothing is an offense by reason that it causes or intended to cause, or that it is known likely to cause any harm, if that harm is so slight. And what is the test of this, whether it is slight or not? That no person of ordinary sense and temper would complain of such harm. Then it is not an offense. If this provision would not be there, trifling acts, then there will be technically so many thefts. If somebody takes my fountain pen for some time, just signs it and returns it to me, it would be technically theft if that pen has been taken without my consent, and the ink which belongs to me, that has been used for signing. Or if a plate is there from which you are having wafers, if I take one or two wafers from that, it will be technically theft, but it will be covered by these exceptions, as no ordinary person, no man of ordinary temper and ordinary sense would complain about such ranks. So law doesn't take notice of trifles. That is what this principle of criminal jurisprudence, which is finding a place here. And now comes a crucial aspect of the general exceptions, that is right of private defense. In common parlance, we call it self-defense, but actually it is not only for self. Self-defense would be a part of private defense. Usually one would apply it for himself. That is why probably in common parlance, self-defense has become more popular term. But the IPC or the law uses the term right of private defense. I can also use the defense, right of defending, which I have against myself to save the others who are close to me, in whom I am interested. I can exercise the right even for their protection. Now, it's not our job in this lecture to study, because all these are very complicated issues in themselves. But I may tell you that the right of private defense extends even to causing death. In certain cases and for certain offenses and in certain circumstances, even you can cause death. Though it may turn out that there was actually no danger to you, because maybe the arm or the revolver which was shown to you by the offender, let us take a hypothetical case, was actually not a genuine revolver, it was a toy revolver. You may believe that it is a genuine revolver, he will fire at you, and therefore if in self-defense you strike him down and he dies as a consequence, then you are fully justified if the case comes in the category where the right of private defense will extend to causing death. Remember, however, the right of private defense exists only when the danger exists. It cannot, like suppose the dacoits are running away and then you hit them and then claim the right of private defense. That will not be called as private defense and will not be excluded from the category of offenses. It won't come under the general exception. One interesting principle from the point of jurisprudence is that even the right of defense of property sometimes extends to causing death. The reasons are different. In serious offenses like robbery and all that, sometimes if you try to resist, death will be a result, because the offenders also coming, many times they are armed and they are also prepared to resort to violence when they undertake such activities. So the right to defend even the property sometimes in proper conditions, section 103 you can study, extends to causing death. And remember, all these are exceptions. There is no question of you getting lesser punishment. It doesn't amount to an offense only. With this, we'll now proceed to the various provisions regarding the trials. Now, the Code of Criminal Procedure, it doesn't define what is a trial. It defines judicial proceedings, and trial is a part of judicial proceedings. Judicial proceeding has been defined as a proceedings in which evidence is or can be legally taken. So, a trial is always a judicial proceeding, but all judicial proceedings are not trial. Generally, the proceedings which take place before the framing of the charge, say in private complaints, they are called as inquiries, in which also evidence can be taken or not. Now, though we speak of trials, we must first understand some basic concepts regarding crimes. Now, crimes are classified in various different categories and types of offenses. So, the offenses are classified into cognizable and non-cognizable. You know, I think this distinction. So, cognizable offense is one in which a police officer can, without a warrant, arrest the offender. A non-cognizable offense is the other offense where the other offenses will be non-cognizable, where a police officer cannot arrest without a warrant. Warrant is to be issued by a magistrate or a court. Now, then there is another classification of the offenses, that is bailable and non-bailable. That is given in the schedule to the Code of Criminal Procedure. It's a policy of law. There is no particular reason for why a particular, there is no set formula. The legislature has done it according to their wisdom. So bailable offenses and non-bailable offense. And there is a third category, one can say that compoundable or non-compoundable. Now we'll see why to understand these categories is important and what is the distinction that it makes. You know that in cognizable offense, apart from arrest, the law provides that a police officer can investigate into any cognizable case, that is, case involving at least one cognizable offense. So then his powers are there, and then once the police investigate, there are so many other powers of search, seizure, arrest, of course. That is the definition itself. And the consequences would be different from the consequences that would follow pursuant to a non-cognizable offense. So therefore, it is necessary to know the distinction between them. Many times, even some advocates sometimes fail to notice, this has been my experience, that junior advocates, they don't understand the distinction between cognizable and non-cognizable. So that is, of course, they must understand. There is a basic difference. Particularly because arrest is the most severe consequence affecting the liberty of a person, and cognizable offense is therefore serious. Now, then comes bailable and non-bailable, which will be of great importance to you in your practical working. Advocates usually deal with the questions of bail. Often they are asked to secure bail. That we'll see what is the concept of bail and all that later on. But in bailable offenses, bail is a matter of right. And in non-bailable offenses, it is a matter of discretion for the court. Non-bailable doesn't mean that the court will not release, but then court may or may not release. In bailable matters, bailable offenses, the court has no such discretion and a person is entitled to be released on bail. Now, compoundable or non-compoundable. As we said, that crimes are considered as wrongs against society. It is not only the victim who is thought to be affected by that wrong, but the whole society is aggrieved. So therefore, the state is in charge of these prosecutions. You know that the trials are conducted by the prosecutor, though private prosecutions in some cases are permissible. But as a rule, it is the state who is interested in detection, investigation, and prosecution of the offenses, prosecution of the offenders, and to see that they are punished, because that is the need of the society. Therefore, the offense is generally not compoundable. Suppose X is murdered by Y. Now, X, his heirs cannot compromise with Y. In civil cases, uh, settlement is always possible. Compounding is a sort of settlement, but that is not possible generally with respect to offenses, because it is not that the rights of the victim alone are affected, but the society's interests are affected, and the society has a stake in ensuring that an offender is punished, and therefore usually the offenses will not be compounded by any understanding between the victim and the offender. But there are exceptions to this. Some offenses, you will see section 320 of the Code of Criminal Procedure, which says which are the offenses which are compoundable. So these type of offenses, as a matter of legislative policy, have been thought to be of as a lesser evils, and where they can be permitted to be settled if the victim and the offender arrive at some understanding. So again, these compoundable are also classified in two categories. Some are compoundable per se, means the court has no discretion. If the parties have settled, the court has to, the order has to be passed, that the order of acquittal has to be passed, or acquittal or discharge, as the case may be, depending on that. Now,
सबसे निवेदन है कृपया करके इस लाइव को ज्यादा से ज्यादा शेयर कर दें ताकि सब तक ये
court will weigh the conditions, see whether it will be a fit case to grant permission to compound, and then grant. Once the permission is granted, they can be compounded. And third, of course, non-compoundable, like serious offenses like murder and all that, they can't be compounded at all. Unfortunately, people will go to the extent of compounding these also if the law would permit, but that's not correct. That is against the policy of penal law, and therefore these offenses are non-compoundable. Now, one, I would like to, because the subject is so vast, I would like to come to the concept of bail, because I have to guess what would be of some interest and of more relevance to you. So those who are on criminal side, practicing on criminal side or intend to do so, they of course know the importance of bail. Bail follows after arrest. Now, as we see that there are certain offenses which are termed as cognizable offenses for which the police can arrest without a warrant. Now, here also I would like to tell you that there are some principles which have been evolved through judicial pronouncements, and they are considered now as a part of the human rights concept, that arrest is not to be mechanically made. The police are given a power to arrest does not mean that they must necessarily arrest. And so arrest is basically discretionary for the police, even if the offense is a cognizable one. Now, section 41 lays down in what circumstances a police officer can arrest without a warrant, and then how prior notice. Now, there have been amendments and addition of certain sections like 41A, etc. Now, these are decided on the basis of the directions given by the Supreme Court in the cases of D.K. Basu, then Joginder Kumar's case, that you must study thoroughly, because all these by themselves are subjects of separate topics, and I've spoken on these. So it's not possible to discuss with these in this lecture. We can't go into all this, except that these are of paramount importance. You must know the rights of the accused persons. Basically, I will say that arrest is necessary only for securing the attendance at trial, then to provide reassurance to the victims and witnesses and remove the fear of accused from their mind. Sometimes it is indeed necessary, because what happens, suppose the crime is committed in broad daylight, on a street, and the offender acting brutally, and if he is not arrested and allowed to move in that locality, there is hardly any possibility that any fair investigation would be possible. People will not come forward to give their statement to the police itself, forget about the subsequent trial. Then again, there may be a possibility of the accused committing further offenses, because if he is apprehended, if he is not apprehended, he may have to take finish his part of taking revenge against some others apart from the victims. Then to ensure his identity properly, to obtain his correct address, etc., also sometimes arrest is necessary. Sometimes an arrest becomes necessary because he obstructs a police officer in the course of investigation. and so on and so forth. But the justification has to be there of arrest, and arrest is not mechanical. That is what I would like to emphasize. These are all pre-trial concepts, but before coming to trial, you must know, because where the investigation has been unfair, there is hardly any possibility of the accused getting a fair trial. Now, there are a number of rights of the accused, and we can see that these are also the principles of criminal jurisprudence. Now, the first is that he should be informed of the grounds of his arrest. The police cannot come just to arrest somebody, and if he asks that what have I done, that the police can say, we will not tell you. That doesn't happen. It's a right of the accused to know what is the allegation against him, which are termed as grounds of arrest. Now, this you will find it's a constitutional guarantee also, Article 22, and which is embodied in Section 50 of the Code of Criminal Procedure also. Now, there is a new amendment, Section 58, that his right to have a friend of or relative of his informed of his arrest. This has been enacted pursuant to the directions given by the Supreme Court in Joginder Kumar's case and D.K. Basu's case, where so many examples were found in many of the states that some people will come without uniform, they will proclaim themselves as police, take away some person, and where he has been taken, what has happened to him, the family members would not even know that. Then again, the right to bail has to be informed to the police. The police are under a duty to inform to the accused that he is entitled to be released on bail if he is accused of having committed a bailable offense. Then that must be informed to him that he has. Then the most important part is the accused has a right to produce before a magistrate without delay. That period has been fixed by the sections 56 and 57, even 57, I think, of the Code of Criminal Procedure, that he should be produced before a magistrate within 24 hours, excluding a period of journey. And this is also a constitutional guarantee that it is in Article 22 of the Constitution. Now, another important right of the accused is right against self-incrimination. The accused cannot be compelled to be a witness against himself. You can't get from him that he has committed the crime, and this is applicable at the investigation stage also. The accused need not answer the questions if they are having a tendency to incriminate him, and he can refuse if the police are interrogating him. It's a different matter that from his refusal, the police will draw appropriate inference. That's a different matter. But they can't compel him to answer. This right of silence of the accused, this is known as right of silence. This is, of course, in the trial also, and that we may deal with that separately at that stage. So the accused has got a right to remain silent. And this, how these principles are interlinked, I would impress upon you. This comes from the principle that the burden is on the prosecution, that he is not to prove anything. The burden is on the prosecution to prove all facts necessary to establish his guilt. Then right to be informed about free legal aid. This is also very important. This is also a constitutional right. Then there are significant rights. One of them, very interesting, because at some higher level also I had noticed ignorance of that. Ignorance means not in that sense, but I have seen even those experienced losing sight of that, that it's slipping from their mind. That this is a constitutional guarantee under Article 20, that no person shall be punished for any offense, shall be subjected to any punishment except for an act which was forbidden at the time of its commission, and nor can he be subjected to a greater penalty than that was provided for that act at that time. It means that the act must be criminal, declared by law as a crime when it is committed. Suppose today you do something which is fully permissible, and tomorrow an act is passed forbidding that, then you cannot be prosecuted for what you have done, because at that time this was no offense. Similarly, a punishment is enhanced. Today, suppose there is a punishment for X offense, the punishment is of 6 months. Tomorrow it is you commit that offense. Then the punishment is enhanced to 3 years. Now you are accused of having committed the offense before the punishment was announced, but before, after you were arrested and prosecuted after the punishment was announced, you cannot be subjected to that punishment. You will be governed by the earlier provisions. These are some very basic principles of criminal law, and you must always be continuously, means you should be conscious of these principles, because it is not that they are not violated or forgotten at times. I have seen such cases happening. Now we'll go a little deeper, about certain aspects of the matter. Now, a trial has to be fair, of course. It is also one of the rights of the accused to have a fair trial. Now, fair trial, it's not defined anywhere, but a fair trial is one which is held by an independent, impartial tribunal, with the parties being treated with full equality. That is in Universal Declaration you will find. And with full opportunity to the parties to adduce evidence in support of their respective contentions. Now, trial has to be an open trial, except for certain offenses, which we'll see because of the special character. Why open trial? Because this is also a principle that justice must not only be done, but also must be seen to have been done. Now, there are reasons for this. An open trial means people can watch for themselves how fairly it is being done. It puts everybody on guard. It makes the prosecutor, the witnesses, quite conscious and cautious of what they are doing. Tyranny or oppression will be reduced if there is a guarantee of open trial, because any such wrong actions, even on the part of the judge, will be noticed by others and criticized. And the awareness of that puts the judge, prosecutor, the witnesses on guard, and rather forces them to behave properly and fairly. Because nobody wants to be seen as unfair. No prosecutor, no witness. A witness doesn't want to be seen as a liar. Then there is another important aspect, of course, which is a part of trial, but I will mention it at this stage only, because that is right against double jeopardy. This is also a constitutional guarantee, and this is also found in Article 300 of the Code of Criminal Procedure, that nobody shall be prosecuted and punished twice for the same offense. And this constitutional guarantee has been expanded further in section 300 of the Code of Criminal Procedure, where even a person is acquitted after a full trial, he cannot be retried again for the same offense, except for the exceptions mentioned in that section. So friends, these are, I think we have covered many principles of criminal jurisprudence and have touched upon the provisions relevant. Now, what happens when the investigation is not over in 24 hours? Then one has to turn to section 167, which provides for detention of the accused persons during the investigation period. And you know that the police cannot detain for more than 24 hours, and any further detention will be only under the orders of the magistrate. But the magistrate's powers are also limited in that regard. The detention cannot be authorized beyond 60 days or 90 days, depending on the nature of the offense. For that, you have to study section 167. If the offense is punishable with death or imprisonment for life or imprisonment for a period up to 10 years, then the maximum permissible period of detention would be 90 days pending investigation. And in other cases, it will be 60 days. So the meaning of this is very clear. Suppose the man is arrested. Police start investigation. The man is remanded into custody by the magistrate from time to time. And then investigation is still incomplete. Now, after the expiry of the period of 60 days or 90 days, the person must be released on bail. The magistrate has no power to authorize his detention, and he can be detained only if he is not willing to or not able to furnish the bail bonds as per the order. The magistrate must necessarily release him on bail. This shows the policy of law, and it flows from the principle of criminal jurisprudence, that you can't just detain people without their guilt having been proved for a long time. There may be investigations which will continue for years, but a man should not be kept in custody during all this period when his guilt is to be established by a trial, and trial will start only when you complete the investigation. Really speaking, when the investigation is still going on, you means the investigating agency may ultimately come with a report that he has not committed any offense. Then who is responsible for this detention? Of course, he will have remedies against the state and all that, but in practice, it will not help. And for a poor person to fight against state, and after having undergone these sufferings of being inside, to file a civil suit or recover damages, it will be very difficult. So the law has, like 24 hours have been thought to be reasonable for the initial police detention. Subsequently, 60 days or 90 days have been thought to be the maximum permissible period, and after that a person must be released on bail. Sometimes I have shown that the junior advocates are not aware of this, that while asking for such mandatory release, the merits of the matter are not to be considered at all. A man might have committed 4 murders, but he is still entitled to be released on bail. And remember, many times this question is asked to me: suppose he is released on bail and then the charge sheet is filed, whether the bail automatically gets cancelled? No, because section 167 says that a person released on bail under that provision is to be treated as a person released on bail ordinarily under the ordinary provisions, which we'll see, the 436, 437, 439. Of course, the provisions regarding cancellation of bail will apply, but the bail doesn't get cancelled or terminated by subsequent completion of the investigation. This is what an important point you must know, because this you will come across this in practice. Many times when the police can't complete the investigation, within time accused gets bail, taking advantage of this provision. And then later on the prosecution thinks that yes, we are delayed by a few days, and they seek cancellation of bail. At that time, one has to emphatically put forth that the grounds for cancellation of bail are to be made out. Automatically it cannot be cancelled, that now the investigation is complete, that time he was released because investigation was in, that sort of argument will not work. But the case must necessarily be made out where cancellation of bail would be justified as per the parameters which we can gather, parameters laid down by various judicial pronouncements. So this is one aspect of the matter which you must know. Now we will have to see, because this subject, as I said, is very vast, and one doesn't know that everything that is stated in Code of Criminal Procedure or even the Evidence Act is actually based on the principles of criminal jurisprudence only. And I gather that you have not much experience of actual working of the court, since you have new entrance to the professions, and certain things, of course, you will know by yourself when you practice. Now, we may now come to the trials. You will know that different types of trials are there. The police complete the investigation and file a charge sheet, and then the trial starts. Similarly, though the state is mainly concerned with prosecutions, a private individual is not forbidden from initiating prosecutions on his own. Like a report can be made to the police, a report can be made to the magistrate also directly. And though some of the recent judgments have taken a view that first you must go to the police, the soundness of these judgments is doubtful in view of some of the earlier judgments of the Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court has said that a person has got an option, a citizen has been given an option either to go to the police or to a magistrate. You can straight away lodge a complaint to the magistrate. Certainly, if the police do not take your complaint into account or refuse to act on it, you have got a right to go before the magistrate. In cases of non-cognizable offences, of course, you will have no other option but to go to the magistrate, because the police cannot investigate. And even if you go to the police, they will advise you to go to the magistrate and obtain orders from it. So once that investigation is done, then a charge sheet is filed. Similarly, if you go to the magistrate directly, then the magistrate examines you on oath. This is mandatory except where a complaint has been made by a public servant acting or purporting to act in discharge of his official duties. In that case, the magistrate may not examine in oath, which is called as verification. In popular, it has become very popular this term, verification of the complaint, which is actually the examination of the complainant, and if any witnesses are produced by him, of such witnesses by the magistrate for a limited purpose of deciding whether or not to proceed with the case. Like in civil cases, you file a plaint and then summons will be issued. Meanwhile, there is no verification by any judicial authority as to whether it discloses a cause of action. That will come after the defendant appears. So, but in criminal cases, the consequences of being summoned being more serious, the law takes this precaution that the magistrate has to arrive at a prima facie satisfaction before issuing process. So in complaint case, when a process is issued, a complaint case starts. Now, there are various types of trials. Now, offenses, in classification offenses, we must know that some offenses are classified as, summons cases. Means some offenses would be triable as summons cases. Trial of that would be summons cases, and some would be warrant cases. Now, summons cases means the offenses which are punishable not exceeding 2 years. These will be summons trials, summons cases we call it. And the other offenses, there will be warrant trials. Then some of the more serious offenses, they are to be tried by the Court of Sessions. But of course, charge sheet will be filed before the magistrate only, and then the magistrate commits the case to the Court of Sessions. That we shall make a reference to that. Now, all these different types of cases necessitate somewhat little difference in the procedure. Like in warrant cases, triable by the magistrate, there it would be necessary to frame a charge. When the police file a charge sheet, the magistrate has to go through this, find out whether there are sufficient grounds for proceeding. He has to hear the accused at that stage, and then decide if he feels that there is no case worth going for the trial, then he can discharge the accused. Otherwise, he will frame a charge and proceed with the case. Summons cases also, the procedure is the same, except that a formal charge need not be framed. Now, rather than concentrating on the differences, we'll see what is the broad, what are the broad provisions about the trials. In sessions cases, of course, the magistrate commits and then the trial starts before the Court of Sessions. Now, first of all, the first part of it, of any type of trial, is to see that supply of documents to the accused. Like it may be charge sheet or the complaint, copy of complaint. Generally, the copy of the complaint is supposed to have been sent along with the summons. But in practice, my practice long back as an advocate also, and when I became a judge later on, from what the parties used to complain before me, I have seen that this is flouted at many times. The copy of the complaint is actually not annexed to the summons, and then later on it is given. But before proceeding further, it becomes a duty of the magistrate to see whether the accused has been supplied with the documents as mentioned in section 207 and 208 of the Code of Criminal Procedure. The first part is supply of copies so that accused knows the allegation against him. There also we come across a principle of criminal jurisdiction, that is to make an accused fully aware of what case he has to meet. He cannot be taken by surprise. One can't say that, okay, if you are not done cheating, you are done forgery. That sort of thing will not do. He must know the allegation precisely. In fact, he should know the list of witnesses also. So the legal provisions are there that in a complaint also, before issuance of summons, a list of witnesses must be filed. In the police reports, that is the charge sheet, what we call popularly, the statements recorded by the police in the course of investigation on which the prosecution proposes to rely, they are invariably given, and if they are not given, they can be taken from the court. In fact, it is the duty of the court to see the duty is actually of the court only. It is cast not on the police. Though the police supply the copies to the court, and court gives these copies to the accused. Then after the supply of copies, then comes a stage of going through the material submitted by the police, and then after hearing the accused, to decide whether to proceed against the accused or not. Now, if a charge is to be framed, the charge will be framed, and the accused will be asked whether he pleads guilty to it. Now, in summons cases, though a charge is not to be framed, particulars of offense are to be explained to the accused. The sufficient particulars are to be explained so as to know what is the precise, so as to let him know what is the precise allegation against him. Now, one interesting thing is that if the accused pleads guilty, it is not obligatory for the court to convict him. Remember, all these provisions reflect the policy of law, which you must understand. It's more important to understand the basic policy and principles of law rather than understanding a particular provision by heart. For two reasons: these provisions can be changed, and secondly, you will never understand them fully, in their spirit at least, if you don't understand the underlying principle. Now, all these types of trial, they provide, if the accused pleads guilty, the magistrate or the judge may, in his discretion, convict him thereupon. Remember, here we are not talking about the false plea of guilty, means which is not clear that it is a plea of guilty, but on a genuine plea of guilty, means it is a proper plea legally of guilty, still the judge is under no obligation to convict him only because the accused pleads guilty. That is, there also comes a principle behind that basically it is the duty of the prosecution to prove the case against an accused, and it is expected to be proved without deriving any support from the accused himself. Many times what happens, his pleas might have been motivated. Many times in case of petty offenses, this person is already in 2-3 months, he is already in custody, because poverty is such a thing. Many times, even after the bail orders are passed, a person is unable to avail of them because he can't make arrangements for the sureties, etc. And then he remains in custody. There are investigating agencies who advise him that you better plead guilty, you will get a lower sentence, otherwise you will have to engage an advocate, his fees, it will take so many years. And many times people are given such ill advice and they actually act on such advice. So the magistrate has to be actually diligent in ensuring, and that is why this provision, that if the plea has been taken of guilty, even then it is not obligatory to convict the accused on the basis of such plea. Even if the plea is taken and there is no apparent flaw in the plea, still a magistrate would be fully justified, magistrate or judge, in issuing summons to the prosecution witnesses and asking them to prove irrespective of the plea of guilty. So these are some provisions. Then a trial starts. Once he pleads guilty, or once he pleads not guilty or is not convicted on plea of guilty, then the trial starts. There are slight variations. We can't go into those details in different types of trials. But broadly, first the witnesses for the prosecution will be examined. The accused will have a right to cross-examine the witnesses. This is also, of course, a very important right. In fact, this is the opportunity to the accused to show that the witnesses are lying, or that they are mistaken, or that they could not have known what they speak of, etc., etc. So then they are cross-examined. Then, of course, after cross-examination, sometimes a re-examination may be permitted. After the witnesses of the prosecution are over, then there is an important provision, section 313. This will be in general provisions that will be applicable to all trials. Section 313 says that the court shall, with the object of giving an opportunity to the accused to explain personally the facts appearing against him in the cross-examination, question him generally about the case. The court has also a power to put any question to the accused without previously warning to him, but that is optional. And this examination of the accused is a must, which is question him generally on the case, law says. And the object is also with a view to enable the accused to explain any of the circumstances appearing in his evidence against him, in the evidence against him. Now, this, unfortunately, the seriousness of this is at times not understood by judges also. In a very perfunctory manner, these examinations are done. Even defense counsel also don't pay proper attention to that, whether it is being taken properly or not. This is actually a very important provision. Accused has got a right to understand what is exactly the case against him and what is the explanation about this evidence. Suppose he is a witness has said that I have seen him with a blood-stained knife. So what have you to say? The accused may say that when I went near the scene of offense, I saw knife lying there, and without realizing anything, I just picked it up. At that time, the witness has seen me. Or he may say that that witness was not there, although that evidence is false. So it depends. The idea and object of that provision is very clear. Now, you must understand some basic things about it. See, the accused, when he is examined, he is not administered any oath. No oath is to be administered upon him. Then he is not liable to answer those questions. As we said, principle is there that he has got a full right to be silent. Right to be silent is a very basic right and accepted in all criminal jurisprudences, that the accused has this right. So he need not answer these questions. Now, he will not be punished if he refuses to answer because he disobeys the court. No punishment is provided for that. Even if the answers given by him are found to be false, he cannot be prosecuted or punished for that. And his refusal to answer by itself will not amount to guilt. But of course, the court cannot be prevented from drawing appropriate inference, short of actual proof of guilt, from his refusal to answer. So this is broadly the provision. Then the trial, at that stage, generally it is the practice of the judges to ask him at that stage only that whether he wants to examine any witness in defense. And that provision is also there. Accused shall be a competent witness for defense, section 315 of the Code of Criminal Procedure. But there is a rider that again is intended to safeguard the rights of the accused, that he shall not be called as a witness except on his own request in writing. In writing is very important. I thought over this procedure. When I was like you, I used to read these provisions and wonder why these provisions are there. And once you think in that way, you never forget the provision, you never forget the principle underlying it. According to me, this is to ensure that in a hurried way, this decision is not taken. This decision may be of quite some significance for the accused, because once he examines himself, he cannot avoid the cross-examination. And many times, if something is, elicited from him in the cross-examination, though it may not be sufficient to hold his guilt, it may prejudice the court tremendously in its appreciation of the evidence. And this may result in miscarriage of justice. So I think the idea in writing is to have clear-cut evidence that he wanted to examine himself as a witness, and further that the decision is not taken hastily and on mere asking by the court or in reply to any question and answer. There is another important provision, and I must tell you that I have seen the breaches of it while sitting as an appellate judge at the sessions level as well as once in the High Court also. See, there is a provision that his failure to lead evidence or his failure to examine himself as a witness shall not be subjected to any comment by the prosecutor or even by the court. I had come across a case where the court had commented that had it been so, he would have easily examined himself and proved this. No, that cannot be done. You can't comment on that. So these are some of the important provisions. As we said, another important principle is that it's a part of the earlier principle that the accused is fully entitled to know what is the case against him. And this principle is that evidence must be taken in his presence. And in an open court is a different matter. So evidence has to be taken in his presence so that he hears the witnesses, what evidence they are giving. And if that is not done, behind his back, if something is said, he is not, that won't be a fair trial, and therefore all the evidence is to be taken in his presence. There are some enactments and some offenses like POCSO and some in cases of rape and all that, where the victim is also traumatized. Some provisions have been made that they don't come together. But nevertheless, the accused is allowed to remain present, though he may not be visible to the victim. The accused is entitled to hear what the victim is saying, and so the evidence is to be taken in the presence of the accused. Now again, there are rules for a record of the examination of the accused, how it is to be made and maintained. That is section 281. Now there are some provisions regarding, the pardon to the accomplice and all that. That will be rather technical, I think, and that will be not. We can't discuss them. I don't think we can do that because they are little complex and not necessary to be dealt with in a lecture or a series of this type. So I think these we have covered all the basic principles of criminal jurisprudence. The fair trial is very necessary, and there is a trend nowadays that fair trial is necessary from the point of view of prosecution also. Initially, the insistence on fair trial was from the side of the accused because it was felt that the rights of the accused were being jeopardized. Now, there is a trend because of various factors, the hostility of witnesses, maybe the insecurity felt by them, that the witnesses are often won over and they deliberately depose against the prosecution, or they don't disclose what they know against the accused, decide from their statements made by them before the investigating officer, and such trial also cannot be considered as a fair trial. Therefore, we have some rules for protection of the witnesses, etc. So that also you will have to study. Now, basically, there are other complex issues, that the entitlement of the accused to all the documents on which the prosecution relies, that is undoubted. But very complex questions come. Sometimes the police have secured a document in the course of investigation. It is available with them, but they don't include it in the charge sheet, and they say we are not relying on it, so we are not bound to provide it to the accused. So technically, they are correct in that regard. But questions arise. Suppose the accused, being aware of the existence of such a document, wants the prosecution to show it to the court. Then what can he do? The answer is that he has to apply to the court, and then the court has got discretion to force the prosecution to give it to the accused in appropriate cases. The concept is only of fairness. It is not that the prosecution has to rely on that. Take a case of different dying declarations. Many times there are 3 dying declarations in a case. So 2 are supporting the prosecution, 1 is going against. The law is very clear that you must give the third one also. You can't suppress that. Though you may say that the third one is unreliable because the accused, it was given under the fear or influence of the accused, etc. That's a different matter. But then you must bring that before the court. These are some concepts. These are in consonance with the principles of criminal jurisprudence, where nothing is to be hidden from the accused. He should know all the facts. Nothing is to be hidden from the court, and the court should know these facts. Now, we have we'll conclude some of the principles because I have seen that people do have problems with that. Now, confession. We'll go to the Evidence Act. Some provisions, we have not touched the provisions of the Evidence Act very much. As all of you know, Section 25 of the Evidence Act says that the confession made to a police officer is irrelevant, not admissible also. Law declares it irrelevant. Means it is not to be taken into consideration at all. Then the confession made to anyone while a person is in police custody is irrelevant unless it is made in the immediate presence of the magistrate. Now, section 27, we'll see. Section 27 is an exception to section 25, 25 and 26 both, which says that it opens with the word provided that when any fact is deposed to as discovered in consequence of the information given by an accused, then so much of the information as distinctly relates to the fact thereby discovered is relevant. So, the practical example of that will say, you must see, in all criminal trials, you will see use of this section, that I will produce the weapon, and then a weapon is produced, and then it is matched with the crime. And the fact that accused knew that is a circumstance against him. It's a part of circumstantial evidence. And that part will be admissible, but not the statement that with this I murdered him. Not only that I will produce that knife. There should be other independent evidence to link it with the offense. You can't prove that the weapon is of the offense. Weapon is the one which is used in the offense from the statement of the accused. You can only produce that part of the statement which leads distinctly to the discovery of that knife. The fact that the accused was knowing it was concealed there is all relevant, but not the further statement of the accused that with this I killed. For that, you have to have other evidence. These are very complex issues, need not be gone into. But section 24 is very important. Section 24 requires a confession to be accepted, admitted in evidence, to be voluntary. Means a confession caused by threat, coercion, inducement, undue influence is not relevant. This, of course, I'm not on that. What I wanted to know, what I feel that people should be more aware of is that how would one decide that a confession is, means who has to prove? Whether the prosecution has to prove that it's a voluntary confession, or the accused has to prove that it is involuntary, or is what caused by threat, duress, or some promise or something like that. So the answer is very simple. It is for the prosecution to affirmatively establish that a confession is voluntary. It is not that the accused has to prove that his confession is not voluntary, but the prosecution has to establish that it was voluntary. And the words used, if it appears to the court. So appears word has been used by the legislature and not proved or believed. If it is believed, appears imports a lesser degree of probability. Court need not go into that deep. And court, if prima facie it appears to the court to have been caused by threat, duress, or some influence to deprive its character as a voluntary confession, then the court has to outright reject it. These are some of the principles. Now, section 164, it permits recording of confessions by the magistrate, and these confessions will of course be admissible, but the magistrates are required to take precautions laid down in the sections. Plus, there are certain other precautions laid down in the rules framed by the high courts, which have been framed under the powers vested in it under 227 of the Constitution, Article 227. High Court has got a power of superintendence and control, and therefore they frame rules also which are to be followed by subordinate court. These conditions are to be scrupulously observed by the magistrates before recording of confessions. But even if it is recorded by a magistrate, if the court thinks that it was not a voluntary one, the court has to disregard it. So these are some principles of criminal jurisprudence. I think we have covered most of the principles as we find at the trial stage, and I hope that you will make further deeper study on these subjects, and you will not only simply understand the provisions, but the principles behind those provisions. And as I said, and at the cost of repeating, I would say it again, that in my opinion, it is essential, more essential, or it is better for you to know the principle behind a provision rather than knowing the provision verbatim, because that is of that is just, that will not give you real understanding, and you are likely to make mistake when there is slight change in the situation. But if you know the principle, there is less likelihood of you are going wrong in any way. Thank you very much. And I was told that there would be some questions and answer after the session. So we may be ready for that. But let me tell you that kindly avoid questions which will be dealing with some cases which you have in hand, or the problems which you are facing in a particular case. We'll have to go by general problems, in general, which problems from the point of view of law, only legal problems. Yes, thank you very much.
Yes, sir. I have filtered those questions accordingly. The first question comes from Mr. Gaurav Chaube. So the question is regarding what happens when appellate court observes that the charges framed by trial court were not proper, and whether that de novo trial will happen, and what will be the fate if the charges in short, the question is regarding framing of wrong charges and its effect on the fate of the judgment.
No, see, this question, framing of wrong charges, what are the consequences of framing of wrong charges, has been stated in the Code of Criminal Procedure only. See, framing of wrong charges by itself will not vitiate the trial unless a failure of justice has been occasioned thereby. And in some cases, if you study the provisions regarding these charges, sometimes even if a charge is not specifically framed, it has been held that a conviction for that charge will be possible. For instance, if a charge is with respect to the offense punishable under section 302 with section 34 of the IPC, then conviction under 302 simpliciter would be possible. The test in such cases is whether the accused was aware of what case he has to make, and whether or not he was misled, and all these provisions you can find in the Code of Criminal Procedure. So it will depend. If the appellate court thinks that way, that it will see how far it has caused prejudice to that, whether the conviction was proper or not, and if it is necessary, it will order a retrial also.
So the next question is regarding rights of the victim. So since the victim is suffering from the crime which is committed, to what extent the victim is allowed to participate? Because as you said, the state is the person who's prosecuting. So to what extent the victim can take part?
Yes. In the traditional criminal jurisprudence, the victim had hardly any role to play, except that some right to receive compensation was available. Now the situation has been changed because it was noticed that the victim has been often neglected in the criminal justice system. So now victim has been given a right to file an appeal also under our proviso to Article 372. In certain circumstances, appeal can be filed. That is, Section 372 says that there will be it provides that no appeal shall lie from unless otherwise provided by this, unless except as provided in the code. I have not read this section in many years, so the exact wording, but it says that an appeal will not lie unless it is so provided by the court. Automatic appeal is not contemplated by the Code of Criminal, but there is a proviso provided that the victim shall have a right to prefer an appeal against any order passed by the court against acquittal or convicting for a lesser offense or imposing inadequate compensation. So this right has been conferred on the victim. Additionally, the victim has been also conferred upon a right is conferred upon the victim to appoint an advocate of the victim's choice to assist the public prosecutor who is conducting the case. So these are broadly the victim's rights, and of course the right to get compensation is always there. That is 357 is there.
Sir, this is regarding the concept of plea bargaining.
Yes.
Can you just in a few words or briefly explain plea bargaining?
Yes. Plea bargaining I have not dealt with because it was a newly introduced provision which according to me has been a total failure. Plea bargaining provided for the accused to bargain with the court about the severity of the sentence. So for certain offenses, as a new chapter was introduced in the CRPC, and it was provided that the accused may, under the circumstances mentioned in that chapter, see that he is willing to bargain the plea. He will plead guilty, and then he will be punished leniently. That is up to 1/4 of the sentence, which would be maximum for that offense. But this has not been successful at all, and this was introduced to reduce the pendency of the cases. But I don't think so that this has affected the pendency in any way, because in the first place, the accused tries to be acquitted. He hopes to be acquitted. Only the persons who are in custody and who are under duress may avail of this. Second thing is that in India, as it is, the sentences are not that severe. For instance, for theft, the punishment is 3 years, but I have seen usually the magistrates are giving from 6 months to 9 months. So as it is less than 1/4 of that. So plea bargaining, I don't think that it takes place, because my acquaintance with the actual working of the trial court is not there now since many years. So in fact, I would be enlightened if some participant or you tell me, Mr. Pathak, what happens about pre-bargaining. I don't think that it is a successful scheme. That is what my reading goes.
Sir, tactically what happens is that if a client comes to you and then you tell him that you plead guilty and then we'll ensure a minimum sentence, so no client wants to suffer a minimum sentence.
Yes,
And
I
with
do
the,
agree with that. That is why I think these provisions are not very helpful, and they have been enacted without properly thinking about the real problem facing this country. Now, the plea bargaining in the other countries from which this was taken, it's of a different type. There it is actually, suppose you are charged of murder, and then you are ready to plead guilty for culpable homicide, then the charge is brought down, and then the prosecutor and the defense counsel, they agree together that yes, he will be convicted for culpable homicide not amounting to murder, and that is how the bargaining takes place. So in India, the provisions are different, and according to me, they have failed to achieve what it was thought they would achieve. Yes.
so the next question is regarding the number of times a person can apply for bail. So it's once it's rejected, then second, third. Like, is there any limit to the number of times he can apply for bail?
No, there is absolutely no limit, and you can keep on applying so long you are in custody. You can always keep on applying for bail. But logically, if the court has rejected it a few days back, then the court will not change its view unless there is some change in the circumstances, or you can point out something new which was not earlier pointed out. I think in Moti Babu or some case, I don't remember Justice Krishna Iyer's, because citation I don't remember of it. But in that, Justice Krishna Iyer has gone to the extent of saying that even on new grounds, you can say, means earlier you had not taken these grounds, you can again take these grounds. You can't be prevented from taking new grounds on by saying that you had earlier not taken it down. He says updated reconsideration is never barred. These are the words used by his lordship, which I remember. Updated consideration of the application. So there is no bar to make repeated bail applications. But usually the court would insist on some change in circumstances. Like suppose the previous application was made and rejected at the investigation stage. So you can say that now investigation is over, so one ground has gone, so consider again. Sometimes one of the accused is granted by one of the co-accused is granted bail by a higher court, and his case is similar to the accused whose bail you are seeking for. So you can now say that when this was rejected, the co-accused was also in custody, but now since he has been released, so I'm entitled to be released on the ground of parity, etc. So there are very many things. We can't generalize. But yes, you can keep on making the bail application. There is no bar.
So next question is regarding trial by the special investigation agencies like CBI, ED, DRI. So whether there is a separate procedure for trial of those cases, or it still falls under the CRPC?
No, that CRPC itself is very clear. Section 5 saves all these special powers, special procedures prescribed. So these acts like prevention of money laundering, it provides for a special procedure, customs, excise. There the investigating agencies are different. Though there are powers to arrest for those offenses, these powers are not exercisable by the police. And therefore, the offenses are sometimes categorized as non-cognizable, but arrest by the particular agency, officers of that agency would be permissible. Now, these agencies cannot file charge sheet like what we call charge sheet, that is the final report under section 173. They can't file, and they file a complaint. And the procedure for trial of complaint cases will have to be followed. So there is a difference in the procedure, but this difference will be as permitted by the CRPC. Means as a general rule, all the offenses, even in any enactment, not only IPC, even other enactments, they will be investigated into as per the provisions of the Code of Criminal Procedure, but subject to any other special provisions made in the special statutes. And in such a case where there are special provisions, the provisions of those statutes will prevail over the CRPC in case of any inconsistency. Any special power conferred on any agency, that will not be affected. So those cases will be. But CBI, you included CBI. CBI is a police body, supposed to be a police organization. So in that case, there will be no difference.
So next question is interesting regarding the case and counter case. So what is the difference between a normal trial and or a trial where the first informant is also accused in another case and the accused is first in another case? So can you just throw some light?
No, will you repeat the question?
Sir, counter cases, sir. So first informant has filed
cross cases. We call it cross cases.
Yes.
So what is the question then?
So whether the trial is same or there are certain minor differences in those cases, like how the evidence is to be taken in the same manner.
That is not specified anywhere in the code, but there are a number of authoritative pronouncements also of the Bombay High Court, and subsequently the Supreme Court has said that same set of facts giving rise to two cases, in which one set of accused is the set of victims in the other case. So in that case, what procedure has been suggested is that evidence will be recorded separately, and both the cases will proceed together, and the judge would pronounce the judgments one by one. Means the evidence, he will have a simultaneous consideration of both the cases and then dispose it of one by one. So the evidence would be separate in each case. He can't rely on the evidence in other case in this case, or vice versa. But both the matters should be together with him. He can't do that just recording the evidence in one case and disposing it off and then commencing with the trial of the other case. That's not so. He will record separate evidence, trials will proceed separate, but they will be together, and then the judgments will be delivered one by one, disposing of both the cases.
Regarding the cross cases, sir, it is my query that don't you think, sir, the prosecutor should be different for both the cases, because the same prosecutor cannot say that this first informant is true, believe him, and then he say he's accused, don't believe him.
Yes, I do agree. Prosecutor has to be different, and it should be generally, but in these cases, there will be some watching advocate or somebody assisting the prosecutor or some special public prosecutor. Same prosecutor, I also agree with you that he can't do like this, because there will be always some difference, because there will be half truths. Because suppose in a case it is said that Z assaulted me, A is saying, and Z himself has sustained any injury, that is always suppressed in such cases. So the injuries on the the prosecuting side has also injuries, and the victim side has also injuries. In other cases, in the other case, they are the prosecutor. So naturally, the prosecutors will have to be different.
Pawar sir, have I missed any queries?
No, sir. With regard to same query with cross complaints or cross cases, there are a few judgments in which it has been held that evidence should be recorded simultaneously in both the cases, whereas in a few judgments it has been held that evidence of one case is to be recorded and thereafter evidence of second case is to be started, and thereafter argument and judgment one by one. Which procedure is to be followed by?
See, I don't. There is one judgment of the Supreme Court, probably I think 92. I can't give you the citation offhand, but it's very famous. It has been repeated in some other cases.
So is it Mishri Lal?
See,
Mishri Lal?
I don't remember now.
Okay.
But in Bombay High Court, original decision was given in Bombay High Court in some case, and thereafter the Supreme Court has also laid down the same principles, which are then often repeated. But see, I don't see, Mr. Pawar, any difference in what you say. The only idea is not to dispose of one case without having the complete picture of the other case before you. That is the idea of this. Now, suppose you record one witness in one case and then you record second witness in the same case, or whether you record first witness in the other case, that doesn't matter. So long as you are not disposing of any case before having the entire picture of the second case. What the courts have said is that you have the entire evidence recorded in one case, entire evidence in the other case, and then dispose of both the cases by giving judgment one after the other. So in such a case, what will happen is that you have the complete facts of the other case also before you. That will enable you to appreciate the evidence properly, and it will not lead to inconsistent findings. Means it will be absurd if the court has to hold one thing in this case and hold exactly to the contrary in the other case, saying that the evidence in this case shows this. So while forming an opinion or expressing belief or disbelief about a particular piece of evidence, it would be necessary to have the versions in both the cases, the evidence in both the cases before the court, though the evidence will be separate in both the cases. So I don't think what is the real problem. Means this is a matter of discretion of the court. Suppose he records 10 witnesses examining evidence in one case only, and then records the evidence in the other cases 10. So long as he is not disposing it off and is hearing arguments and disposing of one by one, then there is no difficulty. But I will have to give a closer look to the Supreme Court judgment. If there are contrary Supreme Court judgments, I don't think so. If there are High Court judgments to the contrary, then they can be disregarded because the Supreme Court judgment will prevail over.
Okay, sir.
Sir, 1990 Supreme Court judgment is there, which is Nathilal versus State of UP.
Yes.
In which it has been held by Supreme Court.
Yes.
In which the Supreme Court has held that evidence of one case should be recorded and argument must be heard. Without pronouncing judgment, he must hear another case and thereafter he dispose of both the cases.
Yes. That is the authority.
Has been held in
Nathilal, same. Yeah, this is the judgment which I was referring to. That is in 92, I thought, but it is 1990. But is there any contrary judgment? Is there any judgment
yes,
which takes a contrary view?
Justice now. Sir, at present, I am not able to find out that judgment. But see,
thank you, sir. Mr. Pawar, what I think is that there is no real difficulty in this. Because see, the main principle is that you are not going to decide one case without knowing what is there in the other case. That is what the principle is there. Now, whether you record the evidence in one case completely, or whether you record half in this case, then half in that case, and when complete the evidence in both the cases together, that is hardly of any consequence so long you are not disposing of the case without taking into consideration the material in the other case also.
Yes.
I request Sujata Jadhav, madam, one of our coordinators, to express vote of thanks on behalf of BCMG.